Let me ask you a question. How would you know if God was acting in the world, in your life, or in the world, in the universe, in a big way? How would you know? How would you be able to stop and identify where God was stepping in to save the day, or to act, to deliver, to redeem in some obvious, powerful, significant way? What would you look for? I suppose some of us would say, well, I'd look for something obvious, right? Something like a story out of the Bible's greatest hits, right? A parting of the seas, or a burning bush, or a chariot of fire, or lightning bolts, or somebody calming the sea. Some powerful, visible, miraculous wonder that would get everybody's attention, right? A total eclipse, or fire in the sky, or an earthquake. Those are the kinds of things that would tell me God was acting in the world, if there was something big and powerful beyond my human ability. Other people might say, no, I think I would look for God in something that seems reasonable or intellectually rigorous, right? I might find some kind of scientific theory that finally explains everything in the universe and makes it reasonable and understandable. If we could finally find the theory of everything that astronomers and physicists have been looking for, if we could finally unlock the Higgs boson or string theory, that would prove to me that God was acting in the world. Or maybe even if I could just find a philosophy of life that finally made sense of everything, that answered questions like, where's God when bad things happen, or how should I behave? If we could all just get it in a theorem, that would show me where God was in the world. All of those sound perfectly reasonable. If I were driving along the road and saw seas parted or a burning bush, I think I should investigate. That might be God. Or if somebody gave me a reasonable proof that they said, here is proof of God's existence or presence, I would find that at least worth a read. It's fascinating to me and surprising to me and wonderful all at the same time that when you ask the Apostle Paul about that very same question, how would you know where God was moving in the world? How would you know how to spot God's definitive action to save, to redeem, to rescue, to restore? He doesn't point us to a miraculous wonder or to a cosmic theorem or to a philosophy or a rule of life. He points us to something that he is the first to admit sounds like nonsense. He points us to the cross. And Paul kind of like wallows and revels in just how nonsensical that is. This coming Sunday, we're going to be observing a day, a lesser known celebration in the church's year called Holy Cross Day on September the 14th. It happens to fall on a Sunday this year, and so it gets to be the center of our worship life this coming Sunday. And it's not just about the historical event of Jesus' crucifixion, but about how the writers of the New Testament see the cross as actually sort of this surprising like key signature of how God operates in the world, that makes sense of and shows us how God moves and lives in the world and saves, and that God's way of saving in the end, God's way of stepping in to put things right, isn't reasonable by our usual definitions, that God ultimately doesn't just bring in the firepower and do something amazing and miraculous, that God doesn't do something like a philosopher would find compelling or a scientist would find reasonable. God does something that looks foolish, that looks weak, that looks nonsensical. God, who's present in Jesus, destroys the powers of death, destroys the power of sin, destroys the power of evil by getting crucified, by being crucified on a cross, on a Roman cross, looking like a loser, looking like he's defeated, by being crucified rather than crucifying his enemies. Even though Paul says, I know that sounds like nonsense, I know that sounds like foolishness, but that's exactly how God operates, exposing the wisdom of the wise by doing something that looks foolish, exposing the weakness of those who see themselves as strong by doing something that looks weak. God's way of saving the world takes all of our usual categories of power and success and wisdom and smarts and intelligence and turns them all upside down. God saves the world in what looks like loss. God wins in the end by what is very clearly defeat for 3 days. God breaks open the power of death by dying. And resurrection comes through on the other side of death, to be sure, but by breaking open death by dying. It sounds nonsensical, and especially because everybody else who lived through and watched and witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus Just about everybody who watched it said, this looks like evil won. This looks like the empire was victorious. This looked like Jesus was the victim, was the loser, was the fool. And Paul says, I know that's what it looks like. This is actually how God saves the world. That in the end, what the world needs is not a new philosophy or 5 helpful hints to have a successful marriage and family or helpful financial resources or plans. That what in the end the world needs isn't something you can reason away or put into a theorem. That even what the world needs isn't a display of firepower and special effects like a parting of the Red Sea or a burning bush, but love that lays down its life for us on a cross, exposing the powers of the day by being crucified by them rather than crucifying his enemies, by praying for forgiveness for his enemies instead of holding a grudge against them, by refusing to answer evil with more evil, but insisting on breaking evil open with good. That's surprising. And that's what the gospel is. This God who saves the world in a way nobody expected, and that takes everything we thought was true with the world and turns it all on its head, only to show us that all along we were the ones who had it upside down to begin with. That's what we're going to be wrestling with this coming Sunday as we celebrate, as we observe Holy Cross Sunday, not just to retell the details of the historical crucifixion of Jesus, but to see with the New Testament that the cross of Jesus is actually this picture of God's surprising logic of saving the world in what looks like defeat, of God's way of winning a victory through loss, of God's kind of wisdom that looks to the world like foolishness. It takes, in a way, a whole lifetime to wrap our minds and our hearts and our heads around it, but we're going to dig into it yet again this coming Sunday. We hope you'll join us then. See ya.